The bread landed in the compost bin with a sound that nobody in the kitchen would forget, not because it was loud. Because of who threw it there, Chef Dominic Arsenault. 2 James Beard nominations, a dining room wait list that ran 6 weeks, and a reputation for being the kind of man who could make a grown cook cry before the morning briefing. Had just taken Petra Lund's sourdough loaf out of the proofing basket, turned it over once in his hands, and dropped it into the organic waste bin like it was a piece of cardboard he'd found on the floor. He didn't even look at her when he did it. "Whose starter is this?" he said, not raising his voice. That was the thing about Arsenault. He never needed to raise his voice. The stillness did the work. Petra was standing at the prep counter, hands still dusted with rye flour, watching him. She was 24. She'd been at Maison Severin for 11 months, hired as a pastry assistant, and quietly reassigned to bread production when the previous bread baker left without notice. No title change, no pay adjustment, just a different station and a longer shift. "Mine," she said. Arsenault finally looked at her. He had the kind of face that showed nothing, not anger, not disdain, just a flat professional calm that somehow felt worse than either. "What flour ratio?" 60% dark rye, 35% heritage red fife, 5% sifted, 78% hydration, 96-hour cold ferment. He was quiet for a moment. "Where did you get a recipe like that?" "I didn't. It's mine." The kitchen went the way kitchens go when something is about to happen. Quieter, tighter, the ambient noise of burners and timers somehow receding. "You developed it?" "Yes." Arsenault picked up his clipboard. "We don't serve rye here. This is a French dining room. Our bread program is brioche and pain de campagne. Nothing else." He set the clipboard down. "I don't know what you thought you were doing, but don't use my proofing baskets for personal experiments. If you have extra time on your shift, come find me and I'll give you something productive." He walked away. Petra stood there for 3 seconds. Then she turned back to her counter, picked up her bench scraper, and went back to work. She had started baking bread when she was 8 years old, in a farmhouse kitchen outside of Rivière-du-Loup, Quebec, where her grandmother Hilde, a woman born in northern Sweden who had married a Quebecois farmer and never quite reconciled the two halves of her life, kept a starter culture in a ceramic crock beside the wood stove. Hilde called it Gamelmore, Old Mother. She said her own mother had kept it alive through 2 world wars and a crossing of the Atlantic, fed it every morning without fail, and passed it down like a piece of furniture. The starter was, according to Hilde, older than the country they were standing in. Whether that was true or slightly embellished, Petra had never been able to determine. But she knew the starter was real. She knew what it smelled like. Sharp and yeasty and faintly of apple cider. And she knew how it behaved in summer versus winter, how it rose differently when you fed it whole grain versus white, how you could tell by the bubble pattern whether the ferment would be long or short. Hilde had never written any of this down. It existed in her hands and her nose and whatever part of the brain stores the things a body has done 10,000 times. She taught Petra the same way, not with measurements, but with feel. More water, less. The dough should pull away from the bowl like this, not like that. When you score it, listen. The blade should sound like fabric tearing, not like it's fighting you. Petra's parents were practical people. Her father drove long-haul freight. Her mother worked at the hospital in Rivière-du-Loup, first as an aide, eventually as an LPN. They were kind and they were tired, and they did not especially understand why their daughter spent in Saturday mornings with her grandmother learning to coax bread out of a clay pot of fermented flour and water. But they didn't stop her either. Hilde died when Petra was 19. She left her the ceramic crock, the Gamelmore still alive inside it, and a handwritten recipe notebook so weathered the pages had gone amber at the edges. Not a formal recipe collection. More like notes to herself, fragments, reminders, cold proof longer in January. Rye needs patience. Don't rush the score. Petra brought the crock with her when she moved to Montreal for culinary school. Kept it in her apartment, fed it every morning before class. Her roommates thought it was strange. Her instructors didn't know what to make of her bread, which tasted different from anything they'd covered in the curriculum. Older, more complex, with a sourness that didn't announce itself until the aftertaste. One instructor, a pastry chef named Blanchard, who had worked in Copenhagen for a decade, ate a slice of Petra's pain au seigle during a practical exam and stopped the evaluation to ask her what she'd done to it. Petra explained the starter, the cold ferment, the rye-to-red fife ratio. Blanchard looked at the loaf for a long moment. Where did you learn this? My grandmother. He nodded slowly. Don't let anyone simplify it. She had carried that sentence with her for 5 years without entirely understanding what he meant. She thought she was starting to understand it now, standing at her station at Maison Severin, watching Arsenault's retreating back. The thing about Arsenault's kitchen was that it operated on a specific and unspoken hierarchy. And the people at the bottom of that hierarchy were expected to understand their position, not because anyone explained it to them, but because the environment made it perfectly clear. The line cooks who had been there more than 2 years had a different posture than the ones who hadn't. They moved with more authority around the walk-in. They occupied the center of the prep counter without being asked. They received Arsenault's criticisms, and he had many, with a particular kind of stillness that indicated familiarity rather than fear. Petra was not yet among them. She had been hired because she was technically excellent and willing to take the pastry assistant position at a salary 2 steps below what her credentials warranted. The restaurant's GM, a polished and perpetually overextended woman named Carol Dufour, had told her during the interview that there was room to grow at Maison Severin. Petra had understood this to mean that the room existed. She had not assumed the door to it would be unlocked. She came in early. She stayed late. She cross-trained on the line when the lunch sous chef needed coverage, picking up skills outside her station because she was curious and because being useful across departments seemed like the right kind of invisible. She made friends slowly, a guard-manger cook named Siu Wai, who shared her break time, and a dishwasher named Régis, who called her La Boulangère and always left a coffee on her counter when he came in at 5 a.m. She kept developing her breads on her own time, not at the restaurant. After the incident with the compost bin, she understood clearly that Arsenault had no interest in what she did with her own flour. She baked at home, in her apartment's oven, experimenting with the Gamelmore in new directions. She had started incorporating a Manitoba hard spring wheat into the base recipe, adjusting the hydration to compensate for the protein content, extending the autolyze to 60 minutes to fully develop the gluten before adding the starter. The result was a loaf with a tighter crumb than traditional sourdough, a deeper caramelization on the crust, and a flavor that was at once familiar and entirely strange. She brought test loaves to the food bank drop on Saturday mornings. She brought extras to the community center, where she occasionally helped with the Friday lunch program for seniors. The seniors, in particular, had opinions. An 83-year-old Ukrainian woman named Halina ate a slice one morning, closed her eyes, and said something in Ukrainian that Petra didn't understand. The volunteer beside her, a retired schoolteacher, translated, "She says it tastes like her mother's bread." Petra drove home that morning with her hands tight on the steering wheel. The call came from a place she hadn't expected. Maison Severin was to be included in a regional showcase event, a fundraising dinner for the Quebec Culinary Heritage Foundation, with 8 restaurants participating, each presenting a single course. Arsenault had been assigned the bread course, which in the context of a heritage-themed event was meant to highlight traditional or regional grain traditions. Petra found this out from Siu Wai, who had overheard it in the walk-in. She didn't say anything. She went home and thought about it for 2 days. Then she typed a short email to Arsenault laying out, in plain language, what she had been developing with the Gamelmore. The heritage grain components, the cold ferment process, the Swedish Quebecois provenance of the recipe itself, and the fact that several iterations of the loaf were already complete and available for tasting. She hit send at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. He read it. She knew he read it because the read receipt came back at 11:40. He did not reply. 3 days later, she arrived at her station to find that her bread notebook, a spiral-bound book she kept in her apron pocket, filled with her own measurements, adjustments, and tasting notes, was missing. She looked everywhere. She asked Régis. She checked the lost and found. The book was gone. 2 days after that, Arsenault announced to the kitchen team that Maison Severin would be presenting a heritage grain sourdough at the foundation dinner. He outlined the process in the briefing. A dark rye and red fife blend, long cold ferment, traditional scoring. He used phrases she recognized, not because they were common, but because she had written them. The hydration ratio he cited was 78%. Siu Wai glanced at her from across the room. Petra was looking at a fixed point on the wall. After the briefing, she went into the walk-in under the pretense of checking stock. She stood among the sheet pans and the cambros and the cold smell of refrigerated produce, and she breathed, slowly, in and out. She could say something. She could walk back out there and say, in front of everyone, that the bread Arsenault had just described was hers, that the recipe was from her notebook which had disappeared from her apron pocket on a Thursday, and that he had read her email 11 minutes before he stopped replying. She could do that. She thought about what would happen if she did. She was 24. She had no James Beard nominations. She had an apartment with a ceramic crock on the counter and a grandmother's handwritten notebook with amber edges and a starter she'd been feeding every morning for 5 years. She thought about Blanchard at culinary school, looking at her loaf and saying, "Don't let anyone simplify it." She came out of the walk-in. She went back to her station. She did not say anything, but she took the Gamelmore crock from her apartment that evening and brought it to her cousin Margot's house for safekeeping. And she sat down that night and wrote everything she remembered, every adjustment, every ratio, every tasting note, into a new notebook in as much detail as she could reconstruct. Then she photographed every page. Then she emailed the photos to herself with a timestamp. The foundation dinner was held in late October in a restored granary in Vieux Montreal that had been converted into an event space. 8 restaurants, 240 guests, tables set with linens the color of unbleached flour, the kind of evening where the food was important and also not the point. The point was the room, the people in the room, the donations that the dinner would generate. Petra was not part of the service team. Arsenault had taken 2 line cooks and his sous chef. She was left at the restaurant with a skeleton crew to handle a quiet Wednesday dinner service. She heard about what happened from Siouai, who had a friend on the event catering staff. The bread had been presented in the 4th course. Small slices served with a cultured butter from a dairy outside Trois-Rivières, paired with a brief explanation of the heritage grain tradition. The guests, according to Siouai's contact, had not merely complimented it. They had asked questions. They had wanted to know about the grain sources. A food journalist from Le Devoir had taken notes. A chef from a restaurant in Ottawa had pulled Arsenault aside and asked specifically about the fermentation process. And then, apparently, something went wrong. What Petra learned later, not from Siouai but from Carol Dufour, who called her into her office the following week with an expression Petra had never seen on her face before, was that Arsenault had been unable to answer the questions. Not because the questions were complicated, because the questions were specific. What strain of red fife had been used? Where was the starter cultured? What was the acidity profile at peak ferment? Was the autolyse done warm or cold? Arsenault had been standing in a beautifully converted granary in front of 240 people, holding a bread that was not his, and he had not known the answers to those questions because he had never made the bread. He had read the notebook. He had reproduced the process, approximately, in the restaurant's oven, with a different starter and a different hand. But the questions being asked of him were the questions of someone who actually knew, who had spent hours in a cold apartment adjusting hydration by percentages of a percentage, who had tasted the dough at every stage, who had baked and failed and baked again. The food journalist from Le Devoir, a man named Fontaine, who had been covering Quebec's culinary scene for 20 years, had apparently grown suspicious during the exchange. He was the kind of journalist who had learned to tell the difference between a chef who knew and a chef who had studied. He began asking the sous chef. The sous chef looked at Arsenault. Arsenault looked at the sous chef. The moment, by all accounts, was very quiet. The next morning, Fontaine published a short piece on Le Devoir's food blog. It did not make accusations. It was careful and precise, and it simply described the dinner and noted that the bread had been, in his estimation, the most remarkable thing served that evening, and that the kitchen team had seemed uncertain when asked about its origins. The comment section did the rest. Carol Dufour's office was on the 2nd floor above the dining room, a small room with a window that looked out over the alley. She had worked in restaurant management for 18 years, and she had seen a variety of situations. But the expression she wore when Petra sat down across from her was one Petra associated with a person who has discovered something unfortunate and is trying to decide what to do about it. "I want to ask you something directly," Carol said. "Okay, the bread at the foundation dinner, the heritage sourdough." She placed both hands flat on her desk. "Is that your recipe?" Petra looked at her for a moment. "Yes." "Did you give it to Chef Arsenault voluntarily?" I sent him an email offering to present my process for the showcase. He didn't respond. She paused. My bread notebook disappeared from my apron the following week. The silence in the room was specific. "Do you have documentation?" Carol said finally. Petra took out her phone. She had the email with timestamps. She had the photos of the original notebook, page by page, with timestamps. She had 5 years of text messages to her cousin Margot about the Gamelmore development. She had a recording, not made with any intent, just a voice memo she'd sent herself one afternoon because she couldn't find a pen, of her explaining the red-fife ratio out loud, dated 4 months before the foundation dinner. She laid her phone on the desk and showed Carol every one of them. Carol sat very still for a long time. "Petra," she said, "I'm going to need a few days." What followed was not swift or clean or particularly satisfying in the way that things are satisfying in stories. It was bureaucratic and uncomfortable, and it involved a lawyer, briefly, and several conversations that Petra was not present for. Arsenault did not make a scene. He did not confess dramatically or apologize publicly. He simply, within 2 weeks of the foundation dinner, resigned from Maison Severin, citing professional differences. The culinary community is not large. Fontaine wrote a follow-up piece after the resignation, still careful, still precise. He did not print Arsenault's name in connection with anything unverifiable, but he did, in the final paragraph, mention that the bread's origin story was more complex than initially presented, and that the technique in question had been developed by a baker trained in a Nordic Quebecois tradition stretching back several generations. He mentioned no name, but he had called Petra the week before and spoken with her for 40 minutes. 3 weeks after the piece ran, he emailed to say that he had passed her name to the director of the Heritage Foundation's culinary grant program. The grant was for emerging food artisans. The application required documentation of a traditional technique with regional roots, a development process, and a plan for sustainable production. Petra applied. She did not tell many people. She wrote the application in 2 evenings, at her kitchen table with the Gamelmore crock on the counter, and Hilda's notebook open beside her laptop, referencing things she had already lived. She was awarded the grant in February. The amount was not enormous, $30,000, which in the context of opening a bakery is a beginning, not an ending. But it was real, it was hers, and it came with something she hadn't expected, a profile in the Foundation's annual publication, distributed to culinary programs, arts councils, and food journalism networks across Quebec and Ontario. The profile included a photograph of Petra at her counter with the Gamelmore crock. It described the Nordic Quebecois heritage of the starter, her grandmother Hilde, the recipe notebook. It quoted her on the difference between a recipe and a tradition. A recipe is instructions. A tradition is everything the instructions can't hold. The smell of the kitchen, the feel of the dough, the reason your grandmother knew to add a little more water in January. That part can't be copied. It can only be passed down. A month after the publication ran, a restaurant in Toronto reached out. Not a restaurant looking for a bread supplier. A restaurant looking for a head baker who could develop their grain program from scratch. A new opening on Ossington, the kind of place that sources its wheat from named farms and has the type of menu that changes with what the land is doing. The chef owner had read the profile. She had, apparently, driven to Montreal on a Saturday, found Petra through a mutual contact, and eaten 3 different loaves before saying anything. Her name was Ingrid Park. She had run a tasting menu restaurant in Vancouver for 9 years before selling it and moving to Ontario. She was methodical and direct, and she had the particular quality of someone who has worked at a high level long enough to know what she doesn't know. "I don't know bread," Ingrid told her, across a table in a coffee shop on Park. "I know what good bread does to a meal. I know this starter has something in it that I've never tasted in a production loaf. I want to build around that. But I need someone who knows what they're doing, and I'm not interested in pretending I know better than you when it comes to this." Petra looked at her for a moment. "That's an unusual thing for a chef owner to say." Ingrid shrugged. "I've seen what the other approach produces." She gave notice at Maison Severin on a Monday in March. Carol Dufour walked her out herself, an unusual gesture, and shook her hand at the door in a way that felt like an apology for something too complicated to name directly. Regis hugged her. He was not a person who hugged people at work, and neither was she. But it happened anyway, quickly, and he pressed a coffee into her hand for the road and said, "Allez, la boulangère." and she walked out into the cold March air with the coffee steaming and the weight of 11 months settling off her shoulders all at once. She moved to Toronto in May, the restaurant Sève, after the French word for sap, for the thing that moves through living wood, opened the following September. The bread program launched with 4 varieties, all built on the Gamelmore base, the heritage sourdough from the foundation dinner, a soft rye and molasses pull-apart that Petra had developed from a fragment in Hild's notebook, a dark seeded loaf with wild rice and black sesame, and a brioche that used the starter in a way that technically made no sense and worked completely. The first review appeared in the Toronto Star 2 weeks after opening. The writer spent 4 sentences on the bread. 4 sentences in a restaurant review on the bread. The loaves at Sève arrive before you've asked for them and disappear before you realize you've eaten most of one. There is a heritage sourdough that carries its age lightly, complex and slightly wild, with a crust that shatters cleanly and an interior that pulls apart in layers. It arrives from a starter the baker has been maintaining for 6 years, a culture originating in northern Sweden that crossed the Atlantic at some point in the previous century. Eat it slowly. The review ran on a Friday. By Saturday evening, the restaurant had a wait list for the following 3 weeks. In the spring of the year after Sève opened, Petra was invited to speak at the Terroir Symposium in Toronto, an annual gathering of Canadian food professionals that tends toward the philosophical end of the culinary conversation. The topic she was given was inheritance and innovation in fermentation. She spent 2 weeks on the talk. She was not a natural public speaker, and she knew it, so she wrote the whole thing out, not to read from it, but to know it well enough that the words would come without the paper. She began, on the night, by placing the Gamelmore crock on the table in front of the podium. "My grandmother kept this starter alive for 60 years, she said. She fed it every morning before she did anything else. She didn't know the science of it. She knew the practice. She knew what it looked like when it was happy and what it looked like when it was struggling. She treated it like something that required her attention the way a garden does, or a relationship." She paused. "Someone once took something from me that they thought was a recipe, a set of ratios, a method. They thought that was what the bread was." She looked out at the room. They were wrong. The bread is everything the recipe can't hold. It's my grandmother's kitchen in January, and the smell of the wood stove, and the way she held her wrist when she turned the dough. You can steal a notebook. You cannot steal 60 years of someone paying attention. The room was quiet for a moment, then it wasn't. Hilda's notebook sits on a shelf in the bakery prep room at Sève now, in a small glass case that Ingrid had made for it. Not precious, not roped off, just visible. Petra takes it down occasionally, more for the feeling of it in her hands than to check anything. She knows the notes by heart. The Gamelmore crock is on the counter every morning when she arrives. She feeds it first, before anything else. Before the ovens are at temperature, before the prep list, before the coffee. Old habit, older than her. She has 3 apprentice bakers now. She teaches them the way Hild taught her. Not with measurements first, but with attention. Here's what the dough feels like when the gluten is ready. Here is what the starter smells like when the ferment is long and cold. Here is January. Here is the way the blade should sound when you score it correctly. Not fighting, not forcing, just like that. There are things that can be written down and things that can't. The things that can't be written down are the ones worth protecting. The things that can't be written down are also, as it turns out, the ones that can't be taken from you.